Dan Hooker broke his arm and one of the bones in his face, but still managed to defeat Jalen Turner at UFC 290 this past weekend. In this video, we're gonna take a closer look at these ridiculously tough injuries. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Sutterer, and my goal in this channel is to help teach you about the medical side of the sports world. So if anatomy and sports injuries interest you, then please consider subscribing to the channel to stay up to date with future videos. Dan Hooker is an absolute dog. Now, there's no doubt that UFC fighters are some of the toughest, if not the toughest athletes on the planet, and what he survived to defeat Jalen Turner was just unbelievable. I have no idea how he took this head kick without going down, but this was likely when the orbital fracture occurred. The forearm fracture seemed to be earlier in the fight, as he said, supposedly in the first round, but let's start with the forearm fracture and then we'll go on to the orbital. This was the image that Hooker shared on Saturday night after the fight. What we're looking at here is an AP, or basically a front-on view of his right wrist and forearm. So this is his right hand, and this is going to be his thumb on this side, and then his pinky is going to be over here on this opposite side. The bones in the wrist, or the carpus, are going to be these bones right here, and then this is going to be the radius, and this is going to be the ulna. These are the two bones of the forearm. And so obviously the fracture that we're looking at here for Hooker is going to be this guy right here. This would be considered an isolated ulnar shaft fracture because it's in the shaft portion of the ulna, and we really don't see any other broken bones here throughout his wrist. It looks like already in this view, we can see that Hooker's wearing a little bit of a splint here on this ulnar side, probably something called an ulnar gutter splint, but this is going to be the fracture location. The fracture almost certainly occurred when Hooker was blocking a kick. So this type of fracture pattern, whenever you're punching directly into a wall or punching an opponent, a lot of the force is going to be transmitted through this radiocarpal joint right here, as opposed to through the ulnar carpal joint on the other side. So what probably happened was one of the kicks from Turner came in and just struck literally the outside portion of Hooker's forearm. And if you feel on yourself, on the pinky side of your forearm, there's really not much muscle protecting that bone. You can feel that bone all the way up to the ulnar styloid. And so likely just a direct kick to that bone was what caused this fracture pattern to occur. Decisions on treatment for this depend on a couple of factors, but we can see from this side view, this lateral x-ray that Hooker shared, how much angulation and displacement there is. So this edge of the ulna should be down here. So there's a lot of overlap, which is one criteria we look at to determine need for surgical intervention. And then also just the degree of angulation, meaning how much the bone is bent. And so here there's a significant amount of shortening. The fracture is displaced. It looks potentially comminuted with a little fracture fragment right here. And so this is something that Hooker is unfortunately going to have to undergo surgery to get this piece of the ulna back down into alignment and then get a plate probably put across it. Next, we'll dive into the orbital fracture and this head kick that Hooker somehow survived. But first, quick shout out from the sponsor of this video. This video is sponsored by Geology. If you want to take better care of your skin and don't know where to start, then Geology is the perfect place. Geology is a 22-time award-winning skin, hair, and body care company that creates simple and effective skincare and hair care routines customized just for you. When you get started, they'll walk you through a quiz that makes sure they're designing a routine that fits your individual needs. Their ingredients are backed by science, and what better test than when my wife was extremely envious when she saw just how high quality these ingredients were back when I started using Geology. Everything gets shipped straight to your front door. My routine starts off with an everyday face wash followed by a daily morning face cream. Then at night, I repeat the face wash followed by a repairing night cream and a nourishing eye cream. They've also expanded into providing great products for hair care and body care with things like natural deodorants, body washes, and excellent hair co-wash. Right now, if you click the link down in the description and use my code Brian70, you're gonna get 70% off their award-winning skincare trial set. On top of that, you're gonna get an additional offer with up to 50% off an add-on body care, skincare, or hair care product when you add it on to your trial set. So take the guesswork out of caring for your skin by checking out Geology today and start to use products that are backed by science, simple, and effective. The more serious of these injuries was certainly this orbital fracture that Hooker sustained, probably from the head kick that we'll look at here in a little bit. What we're looking at here is a 3D reconstruction of a face CT scan. So this takes CT scan slices and then reconstructs them into this 3D model, and we're just looking at the right side of Hooker's face. And you can see he's already kind of circled here where that fracture is occurring. This area is going to be the orbital socket. So the eyeball is sitting right up in there. The ear is going to be sitting further back here, kind of in this location. And then obviously we have the mandible or the lower jaw. This is going to be the maxilla coming up the upper jaw. We're catching a little bit of the sphenoid bone back here and then the zygomatic bone. This kick from Turner is almost certainly when this fracture would have occurred. You can see how his left foot comes up and hits Hooker square in that outer portion of the right side of his face, which is right where that fracture occurred. that zygomatic arch. Whenever you feel on your own face, this kind of bump that you feel here in the front, that's going to be the zygomatic process. And then that bump, if you follow it all the way back around towards your ear, you'll feel this ridge kind of from your ear to that bump. And that's going to be the zygomatic arch. That ridge is right where that fracture appears to be and is right in the location here where Turner's foot comes in and strikes Hooker on the side of the face. I have no idea how Hooker was able to sustain this hit and not just instantly drop. I think this highlights the variability with concussions, that the same impact of blow will sometimes cause a concussion or somebody get knocked out and other times will not. And we don't truly understand exactly where all those forces are going, to where something that looks this serious, he really didn't seem to be fazed at all by it, versus something that looks more mild might completely cause a fighter to go unconscious. But this was almost certainly when that fracture would have occurred. Now, orbital fractures are going to be more serious than just a forearm fracture like we talked about earlier. And the reason is because of the key structures with the eye that sit right here in this area. This is the corresponding location on our biodigital anatomy tool. And this line kind of going through here is going to be that zygomatic process, that zygomatic arch between this bone highlighted in yellow, this temporal bone, and then we're going to have deeper behind it, the sphenoid bone, zygomatic bone, and then in the front, the maxilla. All of these bones come together to form the orbital socket. So there's not just one isolated orbital bone. It's this confluence of multiple bones throughout our skull that come together to form the socket. That then protects the eye and houses the eye and all the extraocular muscles. Whenever any of these bones fracture, we call it an orbital fracture because they comprise that orbital socket. Whenever they fracture, sometimes the piece of bone that's broken can be big enough that it can actually entrap the little muscles that go around the eye to control the eye movements, or can injure the eye itself. It's important though that actually whenever the orbital floor blows out, like if you hear about somebody having an orbital blowout fracture, that's actually a good sign, because the energy, the trauma kind of comes into that orbital socket and then has to go somewhere. If there's this blowout fracture, like if that lower portion of the orbital floor gives out or fractures, the energy transferred through the bone and resulted in a fracture, as opposed to if there's not any sort of break in that orbital floor or blowout like we call it, that energy most likely went to the eye and you can have more significant actual orbit or eye injuries. Hooker's fracture looks like it's more on the outside portion of that orbit as opposed to directly inside the socket itself. So hopefully that spells for a better recovery and not being as significant of an injury long term, with not as much risk to the actual eye itself. Some of the other lines that we're looking at in this picture, like this line up here, for example, is likely just what we call a suture line, where two different bones of the skull sort of fuse together almost like pseudo joints in the head. There is going to be a suture line around this area, but this one looks a lot more irregular, kind of sharp, and of course Hooker's already circled it, so presumably his doctor was kind of pointing to this area. We can see his teeth down here, of course. We catch a little bit of his nasal bone up top. And because this is a CT scan, we of course don't see the eyeball or the muscles. All we see are going to be the bones. It always impresses me and amazes me how strong and tough these dudes are. I mean, if Hooker's correct, he broke his arm in the first round, survived another 2.5 rounds, and then took this kick to the head and presumably broke his bone in his face in the second round and still proceeded to win. I mean, it's just a whole other level of insane toughness and skill that these guys have to be able to continue competing with injuries like this. Neither of these are things that should affect his long-term well-being in the UFC and are very treatable, recoverable types of injuries, unlike something like an ACL tear or a bad ligament injury. These are things he should recover from just fine and continue to have a successful career. That's it for the video, everybody. Let me know, as always, any questions or comments down below. And until next time, we'll see you later.